San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, President Trump signs an order to prioritize artificial intelligence in U.S. government R&D. Will this help the U.S. stay ahead of China? Plus, inside an Apple so-called black site, a new report reveals the not-so-glamorous working conditions for the tech giant's contractors. And New York City's mayor is defending the deal to bring Amazon to the Big Apple, but will the backlash boil over? First, to our top story. President Trump wants the U.S. to be a leader in artificial intelligence for years to come. To achieve that, he's now signed an executive order to launch what he calls the American AI Initiative. The move comes less than a week after the president stressed in his State of the Union that investments in, quote, cutting-edge industries of the future were a necessity for the United States. To tell us more about this executive order, we're joined by Bloomberg's Ben Brody in Washington, who covers tech's corporate lobbying in D.C. And in the studio, we have Greg Brockman, the CTO and co-founder of OpenAI, an AI development organization to ensure a symbiotic existence between human and machine. And Greg, you've actually briefed Congress a couple of times on AI. How big a deal is this executive order?
So I think that we're yet to see how the impacts of the executive order play out, but we're very excited to see the fact that the administration is declaring AI to be an important initiative. That if you look at other countries around the world, South Korea has $1 billion initiative, France has invested $1.8 billion. Many provinces in China are investing between $1 to $2 billion each. And so if you look at the investment in AI around the world, it's something that the U.S. should be taking note of.
China has actually accelerated, Ben, its investment in AI 10 times in recent years. Is this all about U.S.-China competitiveness?
Well, the White House sort of declined to say that this was about China, but I think the message was pretty clear. And I think it's also worth noting that you're talking about these hard numbers, China accelerating, 10 times the funding that it's doing, the provinces that are funding it. We don't see anything like that in this executive order. This is about making R&D funding for artificial intelligence a priority, but they don't say how much of a priority it should be, and they don't appropriate extra monies. No, of course, the power of the purse is Congress, so we can't totally blame the White House for not putting money into this, but I do think it's worth noting that they're not putting a lot of hard fundraising totals, hard funding totals, or even suggesting them.
Greg, what do you make of that?
So I think that one thing that is worth keeping in mind with AI development is that to the extent that it becomes an arms race, that's something that's actually very scary, right? That I think we've seen in recent years that even getting technologies that are very transformative, but where there aren't national stakes at play, it's really hard to make sure that those are going to benefit society and play out in a good way. And so with AI development, I think that it's actually today more about making sure that we set up the international dynamics so that there's coordinated competition, so that we can compete on applications, but can actually coordinate on safety. And I think that the executive order actually does a good job of saying that, hey, we do need to coordinate internationally, and that this is something we need to pay attention to. We don't know exactly what magnitude yet. Interesting.
I recently sat down with Kai-Fu Lee, an AI expert. He used to run Google China before Google left the country. He had this to say about the comparison between the U.S. and China on AI. Take a listen.
Research, China's not going to surpass U.S. for another 20 years with or without any regulations. I mean, U.S. is just so far ahead in research. However, in implementation, China has everything it needs. There's nothing U.S. can do that will slow down China. So it's kind of pointless in AI to look at how to regulate.
Ben, is coordinated competition really a possibility between the U.S. and China in the current environment?
It remains a little bit to be seen how much they can really do that, given what's going on here. I do think it's interesting that they're not talking about export controls or IP, and that's something that the U.S. has used to try and constrain China on, first of all, its tech ambitions, but also in this larger sort of escalating trade war that we have here. And so in some ways, it doesn't talk about the larger competition between the U.S. and China for who's going to kind of control the 21st century and the 22nd 22nd century of tech right now. And I do think it's worth noting that there's a lot less optimism than that the U.S. is going to be dominant here in Washington. So to hear that China is 20 years out, that's not something you hear a lot of. You hear a lot more warnings that we're falling behind, and it's time to step up and really train that workforce and make those investments.
China farther behind on research, though, but not on implementation. Is that an assessment, Greg, that you would agree with?
I think that's actually pretty accurate. One thing that the U.S. does incredibly well is that we import talent from across the world. This is why the U.S. led in science in the 50s, 60s, 70s. If you look at OpenAI, we have, I believe, 19 different native languages that people grew up speaking. So we really are able to get the best people from around the world. As long as we keep doing that, the U.S. is going to keep being ahead in all of the breakthroughs.
I want to talk a little about the importance of building the workforce that is going to be building the AI of the future. I also recently sat down with Genevieve Bell of Intel, who's done some work on ethics and diversity in AI. Take a listen to what she had to say.
I always think that the more voices you have in the room when you're making solutions and you're inventing the future, the more likely you are to find something that's compelling. So for me, the fact that study after study finds that men and women have completely different attitudes to privacy, to data, to security, means that unless we have all those voices in the room, we develop things that don't work for everyone.
So, look, Greg, it's no secret that the tech industry is, today very male-dominated. There have been a lot more focus on diversity initiatives, but will we be able to get the right sort of workforce in place to build the AI of the future and make sure that all perspectives are built into this new technology?
So this question is very core to OpenAI's existence, that our goal is to make sure that artificial intelligence benefits everyone. And I think that on today's trajectory, that we're not looking good on diversity and making sure that we have the right kind of people at the table. And so it's up to organizations, and this is one thing that we want to help push, but really it's the whole industry's responsibility to make sure that we're helping to bring everyone in and to educate the future workforce and stakeholders. And so we have programs like OpenAI Scholars, where we go and we educate people who are just coming into the field. Within 3 months, people can become core contributors.
So, Ben, in terms of implementation, what should we be looking for next, now that this executive order has been signed?
Well, there's a couple things. Where is the money going to come from? Some of it might have to be sort of reprogramming. If some of these agencies get a little more money, then they can probably put the funding to that. But for right now, they're probably going to have to locate it in their budgets, which I think is interesting. The other thing I'm watching is where is industry going to come? We heard from a lot of folks, including IBM, who kind of came out and said, this is what we asked for. This is really what we wanted. This is the targeted funding and education. I think they probably would want a little bit more of that. But that's another thing that I'm going to be watching. And then maybe a third thing is going to be how do you train the workforce, not just for the folks who are going to be doing AI in the future, but those people who are going to be losing their jobs when they're automated by these softwares.
All right, Ben Brody for us in Washington, as well as Greg Brockman of OpenAI. Lots of very important, big issues. Glad to have good people working on them, Greg, so thank you so much for being here. Coming up, Apple's fancy Cupertino campus offers many luxurious perks for employees, but a smaller campus for contractors tells a different story. We will discuss the working conditions at Apple's so-called black site next. This is Bloomberg. While most Apple employees enjoy various perks at its luxurious headquarters, not all of its workers are benefiting. Just 6 blocks away from the main Cupertino campus, the iPhone maker operates a smaller facility for its Maps contractors. It's known as the Black Site for its secrecy, and according to workers there, the environment is far from ideal. Several former and current contractors there spoke to Bloomberg describing challenging conditions, including inadequate facilities and feelings of job insecurity. One even described conditions as dehumanizing. Joining us to discuss, Bloomberg's Joshua Brustein. So, Joshua, what exactly did you find here?
Yeah, so the story centers on a place in Sunnyvale called Hammerwood Avenue. As you said, they refer to it as a black site. There are several hundred employees there, mostly contract employees, although there are some full-time Apple employees there as well. And the contractors I spoke to described a pretty unhappy working environment. All of them said that they kind of took these jobs in the hopes of maybe getting a foot in the door at Apple. That seemed very unlikely once they actually got there. And instead, they worked for a company called Apex Systems, which seemed to always hold over them the idea that they might not make it through the day. They had to enter through the back door. There was a lot of secrecy that just made it feel weird. And most people I talked to kind of had this job, left it, and were pretty unhappy about it.
So, a quote from a former contractor to you: "It was made pretty plain to us that we were at-will employees and they would fire us at any time. There was a culture of fear among the contractors, which I got infected by and probably spread." Then we have this statement from Apple. "Like we do with other suppliers, we will work with Apex to review their management systems, including recruiting and termination protocols, to ensure the terms and conditions of employment are transparent and clearly communicated to workers in advance." Is Apple an outlier here, or is this a common situation for larger tech companies, many of which rely on contractors?
Yeah, one of the reasons that I was interested in this story is because Apple is not really an outlier here. As you said, the tech industry relies very heavily on contractors. It has for quite some time. In different versions, contractors at all the major tech companies will tell similar stories about this. They oftentimes feel as if they are sort of in a lower tier. I don't think that's something even that companies necessarily dispute. They say, these are not people who work for us. We basically don't know about the specifics of how they're being managed and so on. We've contracted with a company to get the work done. And then the question is, how much should they be responsible if those conditions, are not up to the standards that they hope to maintain in their own place of work?
There's been some movement among Google's contractors to, work together as a group to advocate for their rights. Is there any sort of sense that these Apple contractors might do something similar or organize?
There's certainly been some talk. It is hard for contractors to organize in any real way. As I said, there's a lot of job insecurity, which means you can't take many risks. You can't kind of do anything that's going to make you seem like a troublemaker. Also, most of these people don't work at Apple for very long. The contract is for 12 months. Some people stay on for short extensions after that. But when you're going to be at a place for a year, maybe a year and a half, you just don't really have the incentive to take a risk to kind of improve things over the long term.
And tell us a little bit more about what Apple is saying about this story.
Yeah, so Apple says a couple of things. As you said, they said that they were going to talk to Apex about kind of how the job was presented and so specifically some practices around hiring and dismissals. They also made the point that that they are not aware of some of the specifics of the complaints about the management and conditions. Apex is a contractor, which means they are in charge of their employees. And so Apple, it's their stance that there may have been some things that happened, but that's not on us, really. That could happen kind of to anybody.
All right, Bloomberg's Joshua Brustein, great reporting there by you. Good story to check out. Okay, well, both Uber and Lyft have received initial feedback from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission about their confidential IPO filings. The move by the regulator puts the ball back in the company's court to submit new drafts for review. Each had been impacted during the partial U.S. government shutdown. Joining us now to discuss, Bloomberg Tech's Eric Newcomer. So what do we know, Eric, about this feedback from the SEC?
Yeah, we only got sort of dribs and drabs here, but we know that the ball is in sort of Uber and Lyft's court. They've gotten an initial round of feedback, and so now it's going to be on them sort of when they get something back to the SEC. And then, of course, sort of whether the SEC is open or closed because of a government shutdown is going to continue to affect the timing here.
How did the partial shutdown impact these companies?
I think we're going to have to see. The companies, of course, haven't been that clear on timing. In the case of Lyft, we had reporting a while ago now that they were targeting March and April, and my sources still say that that's the timing right now, March or April. So it seems like, at least in the case of Lyft, they're still on track, sort of barring any sort of other change in strategy or a further government shutdown.
Right, that was my next question. There are a lot of unknowns here, including whether the government will stay open for the next few weeks. There is another shutdown possibly looming. If that happens, what does that mean for Uber and Lyft?
Yeah, and I think it's not just the government shutdown, right? I mean, the government shutdown could delay things because the companies are waiting for feedback, want to make sure that everything they're providing to the public investors is sort of appropriate. But I mean, the companies also just have strategic questions that they've always had to make sort of down the line about when they want to go relative to each other, whether they're ready internally. And those questions are sort of opaque to the public, and they're still going to have to make them. So the government shutdown is really just an additional variable in sort of a situation where there are lots of questions about exactly when they're going to go public.
And in terms of exactly when they're going to go public, are we still looking at March, April?
I think, March, April for Lyft is the best reporting we have, and, I would sort of bet on that. And then sort of on the Uber side, I think this year, they sort of talked about the first half. I think that's still very possible, but I think Uber feels sort of much more flexibility to sort of watch the markets and sort of see what the situation is. I think Lyft really still does want to go out before Uber, make sure that some of the key metrics that they think are important, that they get to really sort of define those and not have Uber sort of cloud the whole story. So I think for Lyft, we're going to continue to see that aggressive timeline, and I think Uber is sort of playing it a little more close to the vest.
Interesting. All right, well, we'll potentially watch for Lyft first. Bloomberg Tech's Eric Newcomer, of course. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up, Sonos reported earnings last week, and shares were hit hard by inventory concerns. But analysts aren't quite worried. We'll discuss with the Sonos CEO next. Sonos shares tumbled last week after ending the first quarter with higher inventory levels, even as results topped estimates. Analysts said the inventory issue was disappointing, although most remained broadly positive on the speaker company's future. This comes as the smart speaker space continues to be filled with hot competition from Apple, Amazon, and Google. So how does Sonos plan to keep up? Joining me now, Sonos CEO Patrick Spence. Patrick, great to have you here in the studio.
Thank you.
So you've only been public for a couple of quarters, but
Yes.
you did have your second most profitable quarter ever. Yeah. And yet investors were disappointed by some things you had heard. They have heard. What do you think's driving the sentiment in the stock?
It's always hard to know what's driving the sentiment in the market and with investors. I think we're still a young public company, and so I think investors are still looking to see how we perform over a long period of time. Hardware companies haven't always fared so well, so I think we're a bit paying for sins of the past as we think about other hardware companies that haven't persevered over the long term.
The speaker market has exploded with competition. Amazon, Apple, Google, some more successful than others. Who do you think of as your main competitor?
Well, when you look at it right now, we think about kind of the silent home as our main competition. When we look at the players that are out there, a lot are actually helping more people get into the habit of listening out loud. And there's always been cheap speakers, Bluetooth speakers, those kind of things. And that's really where Google and Amazon and players like that have played in time. And we're the option for those that kind of get a taste of either a voice assistant or a music streaming service and want to listen on something a little better, built to last longer in your home.
So is any one of these companies taking more share than others? I mean, I know you can listen to Alexa on your Sonos speaker, so there are partnerships at play as well.
Yeah, so we work with all of the companies that are in the voice space, also the music streaming space, right? So we work with Spotify, Pandora, SiriusXM, Amazon, Apple, you name it. And so one of the benefits is that we build products that are really built to last for a long period of time. They sound great, and they work with all the services. So you're not trapped in one ecosystem. You can always get whatever you want. And I think that's what consumers are really choosing and why we're able to hit record sales as well last quarter.
Okay, but Amazon and Google have sold a lot of speakers.
Certainly,
and that's not somebody choosing any ecosystem. That's someone choosing a specific ecosystem.
That's right. But then when you're in that ecosystem, the nice thing is that if you're using one of those products and then you think, hey, this is kind of nice. I want to get something for another room of the home, or maybe I want something that kind of looks a little better, sounds better, and maybe also works with Apple or also works with Google. If you bought an Amazon one, that's where Sonos comes in.
So JP Morgan thinks Apple should buy Sonos. What do you think of that?
Right now, I'm really focused on making sure we're a successful independent company. We've been working hard to make sure that we're doing the right thing for the consumers, and ultimately, I don't control that.
Would you be open to a deal if an offer made itself available?
Myself and the other board members would obviously have to look at that and consider, any offer from any company. But right now, I'm really focused on making sure we're a successful public company for the long term.
Now, you're re-examining the Chinese supply chain as a result of the trade war. Tell us what you're seeing and what is Plan B?
Well, so, we've been in China for a long time. The whole supply chain's been built there. Every component is there as well. And I think last week there was some noise that was incorrect about what we were doing. But certainly, we've had a global expansion plan for a while, and you always want to be in the places where your customers are, those kind of things. And so we've always thought about taking our supply chain outside of China, in addition to China, never leaving China, but rather augmenting it. And so we've accelerated those plans on the back of all the tariff noise and everything like that. But that's not something new. That's something we've been working on for months.
So where are you taking the supply chain?
We're considering a couple other spots, but ultimately, since we have a lot of customers in North America, we have a lot of customers in Europe, we'll want to be geographically close to those locations.
Have you seen any impact on sales as a result of the trade war?
We have not, and thankfully to this point, we have not been impacted by the tariffs, so we've been in a good position. And
what would the timeline be for moving your supply chain to different places?
Well, I think again, it's augmenting, but that's something that we want to be able to do, late this year, early next.
And how about a timeline for getting the inventory issues under control?
We've already moderated those. We've had a great January. So we just said last week, it was a couple weeks of inventory. So I think that got a bit overblown, quite frankly.
So talk to us about new product launches and what we'll see beyond speakers.
Yeah, so there's really kind of three ways I think about this. One is that we're really focused on new homes in new countries, because today only 5 countries represent 80% of our sales. So kind of job one is going to new countries. Job two is new products, right? Because we've been at sound for a long period of time, but very focused on the home, right? And so now we're looking outside the home. There's a lot of other places of audio as you think about auto, you think about headphones, you think about commercial. There's a whole bunch of other areas that I think our system gives us unique possibilities into. And the third thing I'd say is that we're also looking at what services we could be offering our customers as well, because that's an interesting area for us. What would be a great thing for listeners for Sonos to offer? And so those are kind of the way I think of the 3 areas.
Would you ever become a content provider like a Spotify or an Apple?
I don't know. There seems to be a lot of a focus there right now, and I think a lot of companies that are doing that very well. So I think we're looking for things that could put us, and do things for listeners that are a little different than what other companies are doing today.
Okay, Sonos CEO Patrick Spence, thanks so much.
Thanks, Emily.
For stopping by. Okay, coming up, we've got a better idea just how bad the numbers for Apple in China were last quarter and just how far they now trail their rivals. That is next. And later in the show, Amazon's search for a second headquarters may not be over just yet. Backlash in New York may have the tech giant backing out. We will discuss. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology Global Link, where we join Bloomberg Daybreak Australia to bring you the latest in global tech news. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco with Heidi Stroud-Watts in Sydney and Sherry An in New York. Let's take a look at the top global tech stories of the day. Sherry?
Emily's self-driving startup Nuro has raised $940 million in financing from the SoftBank Vision Fund. Nuro's tech uses unmanned road vehicle to run errands like picking up groceries to delivering dinner. To date, the startup has raised more than $1 billion from investors, including SoftBank, Greylock, and Garon Capital. EU member states are considering a joint response against a Chinese state-linked hacker group. This comes after UK officials presented evidence of an alleged cyber attack by the group known as APT10. Details of the attack are classified, but the UK's evidence is related to US government indictments against the hackers. The US accuses them of a decade-long espionage campaign. We now have a much clearer indication of how the global smartphone slowdown affected Apple, especially in China. iPhone shipments to China plummeted an estimated 20% in the fourth quarter of 2018. Contrast that with the domestic Chinese market dropping nearly 10% in the same time. That's according to research firm IDC. On the other hand, Apple's local rival Huawei saw its smartphone sales surge 23% in the same quarter. Those are the top global tech stories we're watching. Emily.
Thank you, Sherry. I want to stick with Apple's iPhone woes in China and bring in who else but Bloomberg Tech's Mark Gurman in LA. So, Mark, some interesting trends here. Not only did Apple fall sharply, but we also saw Xiaomi fall sharply at the same time that Huawei rose. What is driving these conflicting trends?
Right. So the most important thing first to note is that the overall market, according to IDC, shrank by 10% year over year in this fourth quarter in China. Now, as part of that, Apple shrank 20%, so double. But Xiaomi, like you said, more than triple percent, falling 35%. And then we have Huawei raising up over 20% to 23%, actually. So, yeah, pretty significant. Apple was obviously hit, as we knew this was going to happen. Huawei, there's a few reasons. One, their devices, always coming out with new ones, cool new products here. They're really touting the tech specs, and those are really pushing their sales. The Apple fall, double. You know, it could have been worse, to be honest. If you look at Xiaomi's 35% number, that's pretty staggering.
So I suppose the question mark we keep asking, is this a China slowdown story? Is this a story about the sort of reticence of the Chinese consumer to spend up the big bucks for the most expensive phones? Or is this really a cyclical story for Apple's life cycle for its product?
I think it's a combination of the last two. I think, one, people are holding on their phones for longer, but that's because of point B, which is the phones are getting more expensive. People don't want to pay between $1,000 and $1,200 up to almost $1,500 on an annual basis to upgrade their phones, especially if they're not major new innovations. If you remember, the leap from the 10 to the 10S was pretty small, but the leap from the iPhone 7 range to the iPhone 10 in 2017, when they did increase the price, was actually a pretty big leap. It was one of the biggest year-over-year overhauls in the iPhone's history, so that price jump really didn't make sense. But going from the 10 to the 10S would make it more difficult for people to want to pay more for those devices.
Mark, what about the speculation that this could be a sentiment issue tied to the U.S.-China trade war? Bank of America wrote that note where they speculated about perhaps an informal boycott is happening of U.S. products or Apple products in China. It just doesn't necessarily jive with seeing Xiaomi drop as well.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. I don't really think the boycott is a real thing creating an impact. I mean, 20% slowdown in iPhone sales because of a boycott, it just does not add up. Maybe we could get away with claiming a boycott resulted in maybe a 1 to 5% drop, but we're talking 1/5 here, 20%. So I think that's way more significant than to be a boycott. I think that's just one of several factors, and it's not even one of the big ones.
Conversely, I do wonder whether a bit of patriotic, consumerism might have contributed to how well Huawei did in that period as well, right? It's been probably the most challenging period for that company, but smartphones remain a bright spot still.
Yeah, I agree with that. We saw what was happening here between the U.S. and Canada with Huawei's CFO. And again, I think by the same token, as I said, on that 1 to 5% impact on the boycott for Apple, or the supposed boycott for Apple, I think that would have the same effect percentage-wise on people buying more Huawei devices. I really don't think that was an impact point. I really just don't think most consumers care about those types of things.
So, Mark, what are you going to be watching through the rest of the year? These market share shifts are always so fascinating. Does it give you any indication about what's coming next? For example, is it going to get worse for Apple?
These things come in waves. I think that Samsung, when they announced their new phones actually on February 20th, we're going to see a little bit spike for them in the second or third quarter because they have their new devices. And then when Apple comes out with the iPhone 11 or whatever they choose to call it, with 3 cameras, a few other new features in the September-October timeframe, then you're going to see another spike for Apple. It just so happened that we're having all these issues compounded by the 10 to 10S upgrade not being very significant. I look at it as one of the smallest year-over-year upgrades in the iPhone's history. Of course, that's not something that's likely to repeat anytime soon. The 2019 iPhone upgrade is going to be a much more notable upgrade than the 10 to the 10S was. And then for 2020, we're expecting an even bigger upgrade with features like a 3D camera for AR and 5G. And of course, 2020 is a big year for Apple, so they're looking for a new design for that year. So I think this is more of a blip than something we're going to see continue to be a pattern.
Mark, if longer term they're not so able to rely on China for that really fast clip of top line growth, what are they actually relying on in terms of services, but also in terms of other geographic opportunities?
I think there's big opportunities in a few markets that we really haven't pinned Apple to lately. I mean, there's South America, there's Russia, there's Africa, there's India, there's all these other growing emerging markets besides China that have really not been tapped. If Apple feels like it's peaked in China or its efforts in that region have tapped out, there's other markets that they can go after, and they know this. They have talked about Africa and India on some of the earnings calls recently. They've mentioned South America. They've mentioned other European regions like Russia and Eastern Europe. These are places that they really don't have much penetration, but they can. But what that's going to come down to is coming out with iPhones more geared toward those regions. They're going to have to play with the pricing. They're going to have to play with their marketing and their functionality to really go after some of those markets. They're going to have to realize that consumers don't necessarily want to spend north of $1,000 on a phone. They're using these trade-in programs to try to mitigate the lack of subsidies from carriers in recent years, but bringing down the prices, basically giving up a little bit of margins here or there in favor of volume could help the company long term. And they know this better than anyone. They've been running this thing for decades. Tim Cook has been there as CEO for almost 10 years. I'm saying it, but he's known this for years too. So they'll fix it.
All right, Bloomberg's very own Mark Gurman, thank you so much for joining us with the latest on iPhone and Apple woes in China. Well, much more ahead, so do stick with us. This is Bloomberg.
New York City Mayor Bill DeBlasio says securing tens of thousands of Amazon jobs is mission critical, adding that other cities were poised to win the coveted second headquarters. DeBlasio spoke at a testimony hearing with the New York State Assembly. Take a listen.
Yes, there were a variety of sites. I think it became very clear during the process that the company preferred the Long Island City site. And obviously that's an area that has been developing, and there is an opportunity to develop more for the kinds of things we care about. We care about more jobs for New Yorkers. We care about creating more affordable housing. We care about fixing our infrastructure. This is a part of the city that's very important to the future of the city. But I want to emphasize this to your question. I think it's a very important one. As I looked at this situation, one of the biggest companies on earth offering the opportunity to bring 25,000 to 40,000 jobs. This was a national competition. Do I think it should be structured that way? No. If I had my druthers, it should not be city competing with city, state competing with state. But I was at a gathering and heard a very powerful point from a former mayor, Senator Bernie Sanders, who said, if we're really going to solve that problem, that requires national legislation to stop that situation where companies can try and set city against city. That said, we had a real-life choice to make. And I think that 25,000 to 40,000 new jobs, many of them good-paying, higher-level jobs that New Yorkers really, really want, that, by the way, are available to a wide range of New Yorkers. Half the jobs in the tech sector are available to folks who don't have a four-year degree. We want to build up our tech community so everyday New Yorkers have jobs. People live in public housing, CUNY graduates. So to me, it was mission critical that this city get those jobs rather than the other cities that I thought were very, very well situated. And to finish the answer, no, we believed that at a very careful tracking of the competition, that there were several other cities poised to win.
Fair enough.
And that we had to strike the right balance.
New York City Mayor Bill DeBlasio there. I want to stick with Amazon in Long Island City. To be or not to be, and bring in Mark Mahaney, analyst at RBC Capital. Currently has an outperform rating on the stock. Also with us, our Bloomberg Tech senior executive editor, Brad Stone, who, of course, wrote the book on Amazon. Brad, what's your take on all of this controversy and whether Amazon is going to back out of New York?
Well, I don't
think they want to. That would be a fairly big retreat. But look, it's become a referendum, not just about the HQ2 process, but about Amazon in general. You've got New York City Council members talking about recognition, the facial recognition feature, and whether Amazon should be selling it to governments. You've got a lot of discussion about Amazon as a non-union shop, even though these aren't blue-collar jobs that are coming to Long Island City. And it's got to be very uncomfortable, and not at all what Jeff Bezos had in mind when he bestowed the award of half of HQ2 on Amazon. So very uncomfortable for them. They've clearly kind of threatened to pull back. Seems like that's probably a negotiating tactic, but we'll have to see where it goes from here.
Now, last week we spoke to one of the state senators who actually has a vote on the committee that can decide yay or nay on this, State Senator Michael Gianaris. Take a listen to what he had to say about the new reporting that Amazon is considering backing out of New York City.
This is the type of extortion by Amazon that's got us into this mess in the first place. They think they could sit there in Seattle and dictate terms and hope that governments bend to their will. Well, it's not going to work.
So by threatening to pull out, Senator Gianaris is saying that is extortion. Mark, does this uncertainty have any impact on the company?
No, not really. And I still am a little stumped. I can't think of another company that has 2 headquarters, or no, 2.5 headquarters, or what are we doing? 1 and 2? I mean, it's sort of an odd thing to begin with. If we just step back, like how many other companies do this? Last time I checked, Walmart's in only one place, Microsoft's in only one place, Boeing's only got 1 headquarters. But nonetheless, the idea that Amazon would have a particularly material economic benefit for whatever locales they go to, I think is true. That they have negotiating leverage, of course they do. And nobody's forcing New York City to do this deal, or Washington, D.C., or Crystal City to do the deal. Anyway, I don't think it has an impact on the company overall. I just found it amusing that they decided to need to have a second headquarters in the first place.
Now, dying to hear what you both think of this Bezos blackmail revelation. Brad, you've obviously covered Amazon and Jeff Bezos for a very long time. And, for many, many years, he gave off the impression of being this family guy, hates the spotlight, doesn't do interviews, sticks to his knitting. But since then, he's obviously expanded into a number of different industries, and then he comes out with this blog post. What do you make of this evolution?
Well, there certainly is one, right? Amazon used to be the thing that Mark and I would excitedly talk about, and now my mom, said, "Did you hear the news about Jeff Bezos today?" I think it's partly a virtue of how important and intertwined Amazon has become in all of our lives. It's the fact that he now has the mantle of the wealthiest person in the world, and it's, of course, his ownership of the Washington Post, which, as he calls it, is a huge complexifier. But I think what's been pretty, consistent throughout is he does tend to want to focus on doing the right thing, and it's clear that this, negotiation and or extortion attempt from AMI really rubbed him the wrong way, and it forced him into a position of taking this enormous risk that this very personal information might come out because he's very passionate about journalistic values and abuse of journalistic privilege, and he wants to take a stand.
Mark, could this have any impact on the company?
Sure, it could actually, if this leads to a lot of distraction by senior management. Yes, I mean, the reason that Amazon has created so much value for shareholders over time, and for a brief period of time was trillion market cap, and could go back to that, is because of the consistency of the management team. I mean, they've done an enormously impressive job across multiple industries. That's kind of one of the really rare things about Amazon succeeding in retail, cloud, now advertising. I mean, those are 3 vastly different industries. So it says something about not just one person, it's never one person, but about the team that he's built up around them, the top 15 to 20 executives. They're really impressive. If something like this comes across and really distracts senior management and distracts Bezos, shareholders should be concerned about that.
Right. So speak about a complexifier. I mean, this situation is complex. And, on the one hand, you have Jeff Bezos saying that he doesn't want to inhibit any publications reporting, that he's committed to journalism. On the other, Amazon gave this statement, Jay Carney gave this statement to the Wall Street Journal for a piece they did saying, "I didn't realize the Wall Street Journal trafficked and warmed over drivel from supermarket tabloids." What do you make of that?
On their earnings call, on the media portion of their earnings call, one of the reporters bravely tried to ask about whether this saga would impact Jeff's ownership stake, whether the divorce, he would have to sell some shares, and the CFO just sort of mercilessly shot down the question. they clearly don't want to have to.
But they are having to address it.
That's right. And so they're kind of trying to have it both ways, which they've tried to do with the press in the past. You know, he's a public figure. He doesn't want to disinvite, any scrutiny. At the same time, he's very offended, clearly, about how AMI has gone about it. And his deputies at Amazon clearly are not comfortable talking about what has now become a very, public private situation.
Meantime, business is proceeding. Amazon just announced it's buying Eero, which is a Wi-Fi router systems maker. Mark, what do you make of this acquisition?
So terms not disclosed, but look, they have a major Wi-Fi device in over 100 million households now, and that's this thing called the Alexa, or the Alexa, the family of Alexa devices. And if you don't have good Wi-Fi, you don't have good Alexa. So there's synergies between these products, and the idea that they're going to get more into physical devices, sure. This is the third or fourth attempt by Amazon to do that. No, fourth or fifth. We got Kindles, Alexa devices. They tried with the Fire Phone, but if you want to be in the home, and Amazon clearly wants to be in the home and get more of that tap in, more of that spend, build up brand awareness. I don't know if their Alexa devices have really led to more sales, but they've almost certainly led to more brand loyalty, customer satisfaction, retention, whatever, with the Amazon Prime program. So bringing in Eero, why not? And there is a clear synergy between that and these Alexa devices.
Do you see any irony or any amount of hypocrisy? Obviously, Amazon's empire is expanding into all of these different categories. Amazon does its own kind of surveillance, and here you have Jeff Bezos talking about blackmail of certainly a different kind. But do you think there's a risk of Bezos and Amazon being called out for that?
Only if they make mistakes, right? And there have been a couple of high-profile ones.
Recognition they've made mistakes.
Well, but I was thinking more of the Alexa that somehow turned over somebody's private conversation to a contact. They called that a snafu and apologized for it. But they have set out some, I think, probably poorly understood restrictions about how they gather information on Alexa devices. If those were to be found to be not secure, or they ended up misusing the data, say for advertising purposes, then they do open themselves up to charges, as you say, of hypocrisy. As for now, I probably kind of don't see that yet.
Mark,
it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off. Look, if you want more personalized services, you've got to give information. I mean, the reason that on Facebook the ads are targeted is because there's a trade-off, and you've been willing to allow them to track your information, or you've given them information. Same thing with Amazon. I mean, hopefully the ads and the services and the product recommendations are better and better because of the data that you voluntarily supplied to them. At some point, for some people, they're going to cross the line. So I'm sure we're going to be dealing with this issue for the next 5 years. Whether they actually get into the Facebook-like crosshairs, Facebook shot itself a couple of times in the foot, if one can do that.
Just a couple.
Yeah.
A few more than a couple.
Yeah. And so Amazon could do that. They've generally been pretty good, I think, at handling these kind of issues in the past. But, the more that they are in people's homes, the more that they have access to this data, there's greater risk here.
All right. Mark Mahaney, RBC Capital, and our own Brad Stone, thank you both.
Thank you.
Can't wait for this saga to unfold. Still ahead, Reddit users have taken to the platform to protest Tencent's new investment, how the Chinese internet giant's involvement could impact free speech. This is Bloomberg. Reddit announced Monday it's raised $300 million in new funding, including an investment from Chinese internet giant Tencent. The new funding round values Reddit at $3 billion, but has sparked backlash from users concerned about potential censorship. Joining us to discuss, Bloomberg's Selena Wang. So it is an unlikely source of funding for a website that prides itself on free speech. What's driving this?
So like its other social media counterparts, Reddit is blocked in China, but this isn't too unusual for Tencent. They've amassed large stakes in tons of tech companies, large and small, all the way from tiny seed roundings and startups all the way to big public companies. They're the largest investor in Snapchat with about a 15% stake. They're also in companies like Tesla and Spotify, Flipkart, and Uber. And in Reddit, it makes a little bit of sense when you look at Tencent's core competency, which is gaming. Now, a lot of its very popular games that it owns or has a stake in, like Fortnite, Clash of Clans, those are topics that are incredibly popular among Reddit users.
Reddit did confirm the funding round, but didn't give us a comment on these free speech issues. Presumably, Reddit doesn't intend to do anything differently, or do they?
Now, there are a lot of users that are posting about how frustrated they are about this investment, and it's been upvoted. There are thousands of comments on links to stories about this investment. But some users have also pointed out that Tencent is an investor in a lot of other tech companies that haven't seen any changes in its censorship or content since Tencent invested. But it is a mere concern among the users about
and
Chinese
Tencent
company
isn't
having
the
a stake.
Chinese government, but Tencent certainly follows the rules that the Chinese government has put out and censors its own site.
It follows the rules within the borders of the country that it operates in. It's not going to go meddling into Spotify or Snapchat's operation abroad. And it's also worth pointing out that it's reported it's about a $150 million investment that it put into Reddit. And at a $3 billion valuation, that's a really small stake. And Tencent also has a reputation for being a pretty passive and stable investor. And from Reddit's perspective, it provides a lot of that interesting expertise, and it has become the juggernaut of the social media space in China and has a lot to learn from them.
Interesting. Well, we will be watching those Reddit threads to see how this one pans out. Selena Wang for Bloomberg Tech, thank you so much. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. We are, of course, live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology and follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.